Today's video is brought to you by Carrie Black, author of Sometimes Illness Wins, A Guide to Understanding and Living with Grief. I'm going to warn you up front that the ad gets a bit personal and serious, but the main video is on the lighter side today, so if the ad gets you down, I hope I'll be able to pick you back up afterwards.
Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, we're looking at the 5th chapter of Ellen G. White's book, The Great Hope, which is basically an abridged collection of writings from her larger book, The Great Controversy. This chapter is called False Hope, and it superficially is focused on spiritualism, but rather than actually talk about whatever practices of spiritualism there may be, she instead uses it as a scapegoat, blaming it for people either not being Christian or not being true Christians if they are Christian. So basically, it's very similar to Chapter 2, but with spiritualism taking the brunt of her ire rather than skepticism. Anyway, let's get into this chapter. But first, a word from our sponsor. Sometimes Illness Wins, A Guide for Understanding and Living with Grief by Carrie Black. When author Carrie Black faced the passing of her daughter, well-meaning people tried so hard to help by giving her books on grieving, but nothing she found was just right. So she wrote a book that she wished existed, Sometimes Illness Wins. It's an illustrated book for all ages about navigating the loss of someone special. Written with the distraught brain in mind, it's an entry-level distillation of available information about the grieving process, what to expect, and what can help. Everyone in my house got a copy of it when Mrs. Rhino passed away, so everyone could make their own notes in it, write their own thoughts and feelings, but reading it together was also a bonding experience. I love that it strongly reinforces the fact that everybody grieves differently, and that that is okay. Because one of the hardest parts of grieving is feeling like your thoughts or emotions are inappropriate to the situation. Reading it together with my kids was really helpful in making sure that they felt safe and loved while expressing themselves in their own unique ways. Everyone grieves differently, so the book approaches grief from a general perspective, but it includes sections where you can fill in details that are specific to your situation. If you or someone you love is going through the grieving process, this book is the perfect accompaniment to well wishes and a thoughtful listener. Sometimes Illness Wins is available for less than the price of a bouquet of flowers. Many readers have found it worthwhile to have extra copies on hand to share with friends and family as the need arises. Grief often comes without warning. Sometimes Illness Wins is grounded in secular evidence-based best practice, and it's both for adults and children. It's written without appeal to religion or superstition. It turns out that once in a while, the book that the world needs would never make the bestseller list, so here it is filling in the gaps. Whether you're going through the grieving process yourself or you want to be prepared to help others in their time of need, please click on the link in the description to order your copy or copies today. It opens by reiterating the last chapter's claim that the idea that humans are naturally immortal originated in pagan philosophy, saying, "In the darkness of the great apostasy, it became a part of the Christian faith, where it has now replaced the truth that the dead know nothing," Ecclesiastes 9:5. If you'll recall, that was my point of agreement with her. Death is the end of consciousness. She just goes a step further than I do and says that all the dead will regain consciousness at the end of the world in order to be judged by God, and those who are not true Christians get sent back into oblivion, not being tortured in hell forever, but just ceasing to exist altogether. In the last video, I questioned how she came to the conclusion that this is supported biblically when there are many references, mostly in the New Testament, to non-believers being eternally punished or tortured or tormented or what have you. As Seventh-day Adventism is not a denomination I have a lot of personal experience with, I'm not as directly familiar with their various apologetics, but several people pointed out in the comments section that the apologetic for this is that when you cease to exist, that itself is an eternal punishment. You will continue to not exist for all of eternity, and not existing is the punishment. Which, it doesn't really seem to fit if we're taking the Bible at face value like Ellen tells us to. Like, Mark 9:47-48 has Jesus telling people to rip their eyes out if they cause them to sin, because it's better to go to heaven with one eye than with two eyes be thrown into hell, where the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. That doesn't sound like you hit the fire and poof, you're gone. That sounds like you're in the fire, being eaten by worms, for eternity. But that's rehashing last chapter stuff. This chapter is about spiritualism. She says that the belief that spirits of the dead return to help the living has prepared the way for modern spiritualism. If the dead are entrusted with knowledge far beyond what they had before, why not return to Earth and instruct the living? And I would agree that if the spirits of the dead are privy to knowledge that would be helpful to the living, and they had the ability to communicate with the living, that would be pretty awesome, and I would totally use that ability after I die. Not only to help my loved ones, but also for prank-related reasons. Because that's just who I am. The fact that this is something that doesn't actually happen leads me to conclude that it's not something that happens. Though Ellen, on the other hand, thinks that something like it happens, but that demons are impersonating the dead loved ones, going so far as to say that the counterfeit is perfect, reproduced with amazing exactness, and even making accurate predictions of the future sometimes. So yeah, we both agree that talking to the spirits of dead loved ones is fake, but she thinks it's because the actual legitimate supernatural experience you have when you do that is with demons pretending to be your loved ones rather than just parlor tricks like cold reading. And, of course, this is all to plant the seeds of religious doctrine that is anti-Christian. Quote, then, as they win people's confidence, they present doctrines that undermine the scriptures. The fact that they speak some truths and at times foretell future events makes them appear reliable, and people accept their false teachings. Now, I don't have extensive experience with people that go to mediums, but what little experience I do have suggests that they don't go looking for doctrinal clarifications. Maybe that was more popular in the 1800s, but I feel like most people would be interested in something like seeking closure. Now, at this point, she does admit that at least some of these experiences are fraudulent, but then doubles down on the idea that some experiences are genuinely supernatural, saying, while it is true that the results of trickery have often been presented as genuine manifestations, there have also been clear exhibitions of supernatural power, the direct work of evil angels. Many believe that spiritualism is nothing more than human fraud. When they come face to face with happenings that they cannot explain as anything but supernatural, they will be deceived and will accept them as the great power of God. Now, does she ever give an example of one of these clear exhibitions of supernatural power? No, of course she doesn't. She also doesn't tell us how one would distinguish between a fraud and demons, though at least that's somewhat understandable, as I'd imagine she would frown on the idea of any true Christians going to a medium in any circumstance, so why would they ever need to know how to tell the real ones from the fake? More to the point, though, how is she even aware of clear exhibitions of superhuman power if she avoids seeking out the people that provide these exhibitions? I feel like she's just taking other people's descriptions of their experience at face value. Anyway, she now gives a nod to the idea that the supernatural experiences from religions other than Christianity are demons as well, by saying that it was with help from Satan that Pharaoh's magicians counterfeited the work of God. For that, she tells us to read Exodus chapter 7 verses 10 through 12, which is when they turn their staves into snakes that get eaten by Moses' staff snake. But the part of the story that I find most interesting here is that in verses 17 through 22, Moses and Aaron turn all of the water in Egypt into blood. And it explicitly says it's all of it. The Nile, the other rivers, the canals, the ponds, the pools of water, and even water in vessels of wood and stone. So all the water is now blood. But then the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. How? If the story is true, there was no more water in Egypt left to be turned to blood. But the magicians managed to do the same thing, turning all the water in Egypt to blood. I mean, yeah, in verse 24 it says that they could still dig for water, so I guess they could have gotten some groundwater to turn to blood, but it doesn't say that they did it differently to a lesser degree. It says they did the same thing. So that doesn't really track. Also, the Bible does explicitly admit to the existence of other gods without blaming their apparent existence on demonic activity. Psalm 95:3 says, "For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods." Psalm 82:1 says, "God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment." Hell, the first commandment of the Ten Commandments is to have no other gods before Yahweh. Why would there need to be a commandment against having other gods if other gods didn't exist in the first place? Also, somewhat unrelated, that's the first commandment in the Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20 versions of the Ten Commandments. It's the second in the Exodus 34 version, which is a much weirder version, and is also the only set of Ten Commandments that the text itself refers to as the Ten Commandments, rather than it just being a heading put in by translators. Anyway, back to Ellen. She brings up the verse in Revelation chapter 13 describing the second beast, which says that he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do. Revelation 13 and 14. This is not predicting mere tricks. People are deceived by the miracles that Satan's agents actually do, not that they only pretend to do. There's a couple things here. Firstly, I don't know what Ellen's timeline looked like when she wrote this, but according to Lesson 9 of the 2019 Adult Bible Study Guide, the second beast of Revelation is the United States, after they established close ties with the newly prominent papacy, which is the first beast. Now, I know from reading through that lesson plan that in other parts of the Great Controversy, Ellen made this same connection, but here she seems to be using a verse that Adventists interpret as referring to the leader of the United States performing miracles in order to turn the population Catholic, as evidence that your random fortune teller shop on the street really does tie into demonic abilities to perform miracles. Also, I would just like to point out that the study guide in the introduction has this to say about the interpretation of prophecies. A word of caution is necessary. It is easier to interpret prophecies already fulfilled in the past, but when it comes to prophecies yet to be fulfilled, as we do in Tuesday's study, we need to be more cautious. God shows us what will happen at the time of the end so that we will not be surprised, but he does not tell us every detail we would like to know. In other words, when looking back on events that have already happened, it's easy to find events that fit vague prophecies that lack in specific details. But obviously, God doesn't give us enough details to be able to say for certain what's going to happen in the future. He only gives us uncertain symbolic language that we'll be able to tie those events to retroactively after they've happened. And we get to see a wonderful example of this as they see that Revelation 13:5 says that the first beast would have authority for 42 months. Well, if a month is 30 days, then 42 times 30 is 1,260, so obviously when the Bible says 42 months, what it meant was 1,260 years. They make the jump from 42 months to 1,260 years by claiming that in the previous chapter, when it says that a woman who was being chased by Satan found a place in the wilderness that was prepared by God, in which she is nourished for 1,260 days, which is the time frame given in verse 6, in verse 14 it says that she is nourished in the wilderness for a time and times and half a time. So that's 3.5 if we assume that the plural on and times means exactly 2. So that's 3.5 years, which would be 42 months. Therefore, when it says days, it meant prophecy years. Also, we have to ignore that for 1,260 days to equal 3.5 years, a year would have to have 360 days in it, as opposed to the 365.24 days that it actually has in it. And yes, I know the Jewish calendar year does have 360 days in it, but that's another thing. Why would God not give his chosen people a year that matches up with, a year? And I swear, I am trying to give this a steel man, but the switch from days to years is just so arbitrary. Like, here, I'll read exactly what the study guide says verbatim about their switch to years. Revelation 13:5-7 states that the period of the beast's persecuting activities through Christian history is 42 months. As we have seen, persecution of the pure woman lasted for a time and times and half a time. That is 3.5 times, or prophetic years. Revelation 12:13-14 compared to Daniel 7:25. 42 prophetic months equals 30 days multiplied by 42, or 1,260 days/years, Revelation 12:6. Therefore, a time and times and half a times, 42 months and 1,260 days, all refer to the same time period of 1,260 years. The jump from days to years seems completely unjustified. Like, even if we read that verse in Daniel that they said to look at, it doesn't say that it's 1,260 years. But like I said, this is an example of them retroactively making the prophecy fit, and we see that here. They seem to start with the French Revolution in 1798 when Napoleon took the Pope prisoner, with that representing the fatal wound suffered by the first beast in Revelation 13:3. After that was decided on, they subtract 1,260 years, bringing us to the year 538. So 538 is where we should see the Catholic Church seeing their power and authority beginning. And indeed, they say that 538 marks appropriately the beginning of this prophetic period when the Roman Church, with the Pope as its head, established itself as a church-state power that dominated the Western world throughout medieval times. So, what happened in 538? Well, the Goths besieged Rome for a little over a year, going from 537 to 538, before being beaten back when Roman reinforcements arrived. Now, during the siege, the Pope was removed from power to be replaced with a Pope selected by the Emperor, which marked the beginning of the Byzantine papacy, where each Pope was required to be approved by the Byzantine Emperor. This did mark an increase in the Church's tie-in with politics, but it's hardly a sharp delineating event, and what's more, the actual replacing of the Pope happened in 537, 1,261 years before Napoleon imprisoned Pope Pius VI, not 1,260. Really, if you want a sharp event marking the increase of the Church's power, the 4th century is probably the best place to look. Between 312 and 380, the Church went from being a persecuted and disparate group of different sects, to being a legally privileged group of which the Roman Emperor was a member, to being the official state religion of the Roman Empire. There are several key events in that time period that could be counted as the beginning, and each one is more important to the Church's rise in power than the beginning of the Byzantine papacy. So, yeah, all this to say that it's relatively easy to make past events fit with vague prophecies, as long as you're willing to play fast and loose with which events count and which to ignore, and even with the time frames, with God being off by a year in this case. Also worth mentioning is that this prophecy actually seems to have been directed at Emperor Nero and was written after the events. If you transliterate the name Nero Caesar from Greek into Hebrew and then use the Hebrew numerological system known as Gematria, Nero Caesar adds up to 666. But earlier manuscripts have the number 616 though, doesn't that throw a wrench in there? Well, if you transliterate it from Latin to Hebrew and then do the same calculation, it adds up to 616. Nero was also the 6th emperor of Rome, which would match up with the beast's 7 heads being the 7 kings in Revelation 17:10, with the 6th king being the one who is. So, someone writing after the fact but writing as though they are prophetic would have portrayed Neil as still being alive. The beast is also said to be a religious leader, blaspheming God and demanding worship. Nero was one of only 2 emperors who demanded to be worshipped while still alive, with Nero claiming to be the sun god Apollo, even having coins minted that referred to him as the savior and benefactor of the world. That also ticks the box of having to accept the number of the beast in order to buy or sell things. And Nero's persecution of Christians in Rome after the fire lasted until his death in 68 CE, approximately 42 months. That one's a bit sketchy though. We don't know exactly when the persecution began, with some historians even questioning its overall historicity. What we do know is that it began as a result of the rumor that Nero started the fire, as he tried to shift the blame away from himself and onto another group. The fire to Nero's death is just shy of 4 years, so if it took about 5 months for the rumors of Nero starting the fire to percolate and actually reach his ears, which is an entirely plausible duration, then the persecution would have been about 42 months. Of course, Revelation 13 describes 2 beasts, one from the sea and one from the earth. Nero would be the first beast, with his authority to persecute Christians lasting 42 months, and the official imperial cult that promoted the worship of Nero would be the second. Anyway, the various Christian end times prophecies could be an entire video on their own. That was just meant to show how easy it is to fit historical events into biblical prophecy, with the Nero interpretation actually being one of the better fits. Bonus, I didn't have to assume that by months the author actually meant the number of years that would be equal to the number of days that make up those months. So, back to Ellen. The next section is called Satan's Appeal to Intellectuals, and it opens with the statement, "To cultured and refined people, the Prince of Darkness presents the more refined and intellectual aspects of spiritualism. He delights the imagination with entrancing scenes and eloquent portrayals of love and charity. He leads people to take such great pride in their own wisdom that in their hearts they despise the Eternal One." I find it interesting that this is her view of intellectualism. Nothing actually intellectual, just eloquence, love, and charity, visions of which are used to ensnare the intellectuals by causing them to take pride in their own wisdom. And honestly, if your wisdom leads you to greater eloquence, charity, and love, I fail to see the problem. I mean, eloquence is largely superficial, and there are plenty of eloquent people who make a pretense of being intellectuals without actually having any substance to back it up, but those people generally focus on enriching themselves rather than spreading a message of love and charity. But she says that intellectual spiritualism leads people to be deceived by the same claim that Satan made in Eden. You will be like God. Humans are creatures of progress, and as we progress, we become more godlike ourselves. Our moral judgment is correct because it's a self-judgment. Except anyone who spent any time looking into a moral philosophy will be able to tell you that people who actually spend time contemplating such things don't arrive at such simplistic conclusions. But of course, no matter how nuanced a moral philosophy you may have, that's really just Satan substituting a person's own sinful human nature for the law of God. She says, if self is the highest ideal, they will never reach anything higher. The grace of God alone has the power to exalt them. If they are left to themselves, their path will be downward. But that's exactly my point. Self is not the highest ideal. Most moral philosophies would agree that self-sacrifice for the greater good is something to be celebrated, whether that be sacrifice of your time or resources in order to make the lives of others better, or whether it be a more literal self-sacrifice where you give up your life in the defense of others. If self is the highest ideal, then self-preservation and self-enrichment would be the most celebrated moral actions. but they are, in most moral systems, neutral at best, with self-enrichment at the expense of others being seen as a negative in most of them. I'm also completely unclear what any of this has to do with spiritualism. How does thinking that you're talking to a dead loved one lead you to believe that you are yourself godlike and morally perfect? I don't see the connection, and Ellen never clarifies. It's just assumed that that connection is apparent, and then that's the end of that section. The next section is the appeal to the pleasure-loving. To people who are self-indulgent, pleasure-loving, and sensual, spiritualism appears in a less subtle disguise. Satan notes the sin each individual is inclined to commit, and then makes sure that opportunity comes along to gratify the tendency. So, this is a place where I can at least kinda see how she got there, though again I see no connection to going to see mediums, it's just a part of life. If you have a tendency to overindulge in a particular behavior to the point where it could become detrimental, it's not so much that Satan has made a note of this fact and so presents you with opportunities, it's more that the opportunities for such indulgences are pretty ubiquitous in our society, some more so than others, but they're all there. So if you go looking for them, you'll find them. If you have trouble with alcoholism, bars and liquor stores are easy to find. If you cheat on your romantic partners, Tinder has made that a relatively easy process nowadays, and sex workers have always been easy to find. And just to clarify here, I'm not equating cheating on your partner with alcoholism. Those are two very different scenarios with different causes, nor am I making a moral judgment on sex workers. If two consenting adults agree to exchange sex for money, that exchange in and of itself is not problematic, and it's not the sex worker's responsibility to make sure that their customer isn't cheating on someone. And I also recognize that while sex work is not inherently problematic, it often occurs in very problematic ways, with the workers being victimized and taken advantage of. This is not universal, but it's common enough that it should be said. And honestly, one of the easiest ways to deal with that problem is to legalize sex work so that it can be regulated like any other industry. New Zealand is an excellent example of this. Prostitution has been legal there since 2003, and there are a number of laws on the books protecting sex workers from exploitation and giving them the ability to report abusive or exploitative behaviors to police. Anyway, back to the idea that Satan is presenting you with temptations. It's not Satan, it's just that those things exist in society, so people that are more disposed towards certain temptations will be able to find them easily. If gambling held any appeal to me, I'd easily be able to spend a bunch of money at the racetrack in town or the casino that's a short drive away, not to mention playing the lottery and scratch-off tickets, but gambling has never been interesting to me, so despite working in multiple buildings connected to multiple casinos in my lifetime, I have only once actually entered a casino as a client. I went in with $20, I won 60 on my first pull at a slot machine, pocketed 40, and spent the other 20. I'm one of the very few people who can honestly say, when measuring lifetime winnings and losses, I turned a profit at the casino. My point is, Satan has no more place gambling at my feet to tempt me than he has anyone else that lives in my area. It's just a thing that exists here, and those who are inclined to engage in that activity will do so. At this point, she attempts to tie it back to spiritualism by saying, the spirits declare that true knowledge places a person above all law, that whatever is right, that God does not condemn, and that all sins are innocent. When people believe that desire is the highest law, that liberty is license, and that they are accountable only to themselves, who can be surprised that corruption flourishes everywhere? Again, I don't really see this as something that people would go to a medium for. Generally, when people go to a medium to talk to a dead loved one, it's for closure. Did they forgive me for that fight we had? Do they approve of my current romantic relationship? Did they really like that Christmas present, or were they just pretending? Those are the kinds of questions that people ask of the dead. They aren't looking for doctrinal clarification. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I've never been to a medium. I have no intention of ever going to one. I don't believe they're real. They're all basically just cold reading. And even if that is the main reason people go to mediums today, maybe the 1800s was different. I don't actually know. But this doesn't seem all that plausible to me. But she does point out that the Bible strictly prohibits dealing with the spirits of the dead, with Leviticus 19:31 telling us not to turn to mediums or necromancers, and Leviticus 20:27 sentencing mediums and necromancers to death. Though she seems to think that this is because of that verse in Ecclesiastes that says the dead know nothing, so obviously any spirits of dead people will actually be demons impersonating them. But if we turn to 1 Samuel 28, we get the story of the Witch of Endor, a small fuzzy little woman who looked a bit like a teddy bear.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, shut up. I know that's a cliched joke, but she doesn't get a description in the Bible, so this is what I'm going with. After Saul begs God to tell him what to do, God ignores him. So he turns to the Witch of Endor, who calls up the spirit of the prophet Samuel. No hint is given that Samuel is anything but genuine. He doesn't do what Ellen says the spirits do here and tell Saul how amazing it would be to ignore the will of God and be answerable only to himself. No, he speaks in exactly the way Samuel would have spoken while he was alive, chastising Saul for making an enemy of God and telling him that this is what God foretold, that he would lose his battles and David would take over his kingdom in the end. That was not what Saul wanted to hear, and that was in perfect alignment with what God had declared earlier. What good would it be for Satan to reiterate God's actual message to Saul? Everything about this story reads as though it's genuinely the spirit of a dead prophet who is returning to talk to Saul, not a demon pretender trying to push Saul further from God's ways. The next section is called Bible Represented as Fiction, and opens with the sentence, "Lying spirits impersonate the apostles, making them contradict what they wrote when on earth." Well, hate to break it to you, Ellen, but I don't need dusty spirits of dead religious figures to lead me to the conclusion that the Bible is fiction. Hell, they don't even need to come back from the dead to be presented as though they are contradicting what they wrote while alive. They did plenty of contradicting while they were doing their original writing. And these contradictions don't really matter one whit when deciding whether or not the Bible is fiction. The fact that many of the stories of the Bible are physically impossible and, according to all the evidence we have, did not happen, is enough to call the Bible fiction without the contradictions. She follows up by saying that Satan is making the world believe that the Bible is a fiction, a book suited to the infancy of the race but obsolete today. And yeah, I actually disagree. I think that if the Bible actually came from an all-powerful, all-knowing God who actually wanted what was best for us, it wouldn't be obsolete, but neither would it be tailored to one specific culture of one small region of the planet that lived like 6,000 years ago. And because it was tailored to them, most of it is obsolete. So it must not have actually come from this all-powerful, all-knowing being. I mean, just read the damn thing. It lays out compensation schemes for breaking God's rules in terms of the timeless currencies of sheep, goats, and shekels. Not to mention the laws that are surely still relevant to us today, like Deuteronomy 22:12, demanding that we have tassels on the four corners of our garments. I don't see anything about Ellen that suggests that she was a regular wearer of the tallit, the garment that Orthodox Jews often wear under their shirts, which has these tassels on its four corners. When searching on Adventist.org, only one page comes up that contains a reference to the tallit, and it's written from a perspective of explaining this quirky Jewish tradition in terms of how it actually points to Jesus as the savior without even hinting at the idea that we should observe these rules ourselves. One might say that they are not relevant to the modern age. They are, say it with me, obsolete. And yeah, you can hand-wave away Old Testament stuff pretty easily by appealing to Jesus fulfilling the law or whatever so that we don't have to go through all the rigmarole of earning forgiveness of sins. But this very act renders a good chunk of the Bible obsolete. There is no enduring life lesson or message to be found in the command to buy your chattel slaves from neighboring countries, no modern usefulness to be found in the punishment of falsely accusing your bride of not being a virgin on your wedding night, of being a whipping and 100 shekel fine. My point is, there are plenty of commands in the Bible that Ellen herself would dismiss as obsolete, even if she wouldn't phrase it that way, while giving various excuses like it being a law meant for specific people in a specific time in order to avoid calling it obsolete. And as much as she might protest, that fits the definition of obsolete quite nicely. And realistically, as far as moral commands go, the Bible is mediocre at best. Jesus didn't introduce anything new to moral philosophy, and there was a lot of bad advice he gave as well. Like that thing in Matthew 6 that was the whole, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or drink, or about what clothes you'll wear, because God makes sure that even the birds are fed, even though they don't sow or reap or store food, and you're more valuable than birds, right? Not only is that bad advice, it's not even accurate. Many species of birds do indeed store food, and birds starve to death all the time. This passage has led many over the years to, follow its advice and not plan for the future, choosing to rely on God to provide, and then winding up stuck in bad situations because they trusted God and he failed to provide. I remember being a Christian and hearing stories of how faithful people would do things that most people would consider financially irresponsible, and when things looked like they were about to take a turn for the worst, an anonymous donor showed up with a check for $25,000. God is good! Hallelujah! God provides! Hell, one of the churches I went to used this passage as an excuse to get some expensive renovations done in the sanctuary before they had the money to pay for it. And then when the money failed to miraculously appear when needed, they resorted to doing a lengthy sermon series on the importance of tithing to the church. Anyway, I feel like this is the perfect time for a check-in on them, and we'll let you be the judge of whether or not God took care of them. This is what the church looked like in 2009 when I attended. There's actually a decent chance that the black car in the parking lot behind the sign was my car. And here's what it looks like today. How about that? It seems to have miraculously transformed into a hole in the ground. Praise Jesus! At least God gave them a bigger spot for baptisms. Anyway, she goes on to say that believers in spirit appearances try to make it seem like there is nothing miraculous in our Savior's life. They declare that their own miracles are far greater than the works of Christ. Spiritualism is now adopting a Christian appearance, but it cannot deny or hide its teachings. In its present form, it is a more dangerous and more subtle deception. It now professes to accept Christ and the Bible, but it interprets the Bible in a way that is pleasing to the unrenewed heart. It dwells on love as the chief attribute of God, but it degrades this love to a weak sentimentalism. God's condemnation of sin, the requirements of his holy law, are kept out of sight. So apparently people are talking to dead spirits in church now while simultaneously denying the miracles of Jesus? It wouldn't surprise me if such denominations did exist, but they are far from being the most popular ones. Though I've had a bit of an epiphany during this chapter. It strikes me that Ellen joined one of the many religions that started in the burned-over district in New York, the Millerites, so she was likely exposed to all the other wild variations on Christianity that were cropping up in that area at the same time. So this could explain why she focuses so heavily on presenting everything that's not atheism as a weird and distorted version of Christianity. Her version of Christianity has its roots in the same place as other versions that mainstream Christians either don't consider to be Christian, or think of as sorta kinda Christian, like Mormonism or the sex cult turned silverware company known as the Oneida Community. And indeed, upon looking into what other religions sprang up in the area, spiritualism is on the list, with the Fox sisters being largely credited for giving the movement its start by holding public seances. And indeed, some of the most vocal proponents of spiritualism were people of a scientific bent. Physicians, inventors, biologists. Thomas Edison was one of its promoters, as was Alfred Russel Wallace, the guy who joined Darwin in the initial presentation of the theory of evolution. It has been thought that this turn to spiritualism was a way to reconcile God and science. The Bible was now so clearly wrong about so much, but people were claiming to communicate with the dead. Surely the dead can tell us the truth about God. Many saw spiritualism as a scientific way to prove God. So yeah, thus far I've been thinking about her references to spiritualism in a modern sense, but the movement was very much just beginning in the 1840s and 50s when she was writing this book, and it appears to have been used as scientific evidence of God, at least occasionally, so maybe people were going to mediums for theological questions at the time. She goes on to use that tired old trope, which I guess was brand new for her, of saying that people get into spiritualism out of curiosity. Going to a medium once won't hurt, right? Aha, but that's when Satan strikes. If he can get them to submit their minds to his direction just once, he will hold them captive. Nothing but the power of God in answer to earnest prayer can deliver them. But this brings me to another question. Why is Satan so powerful that only God can drive him away? Why would God not strip Satan of his powers when he cast him out of heaven? The whole movement of spiritualism, if you believe that the dead spirits who are communicating with the living are actually demons, would be impossible if God just stripped the demons of their power that they have to impersonate the dead. Like, would humanity have even fallen in the first place if God didn't allow Satan to keep his possess animals and talk even though they don't have vocal cords power? In the first chapter, the one that explains evil while saying it can't be explained, she makes it seem like humans and Satan kind of share the blame about equally. But in every chapter since then, any bad things that humans do are directly tied to Satan enticing them to do so. If God took away the powers that Satan uses to do that, would humanity not be way better off? Why doesn't God strip Satan's powers then? She begins the conclusion of this chapter by saying, spirits of devils impersonating relatives or friends will appeal to our tender sympathies and will work miracles. We must resist them with the Bible truth that the dead know nothing and that they who appear this way are the spirits of devils. Which, again raises the question of why God allows devils to have the ability to appear as spirits to us in the first place, but also has us wondering, why do devils perform miracles but God apparently does not? Well, according to AdventistBiblicalResearch.org, miracles do still happen today, but God does them secretly and silently, because in the end times, the forces of evil will use miracles to claim to be from God. So if God performs obvious miracles, then true Christians will think that he's evil, I guess. I don't know, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but they also take credit for modern medicine, calling that God's healing miracles. Take that, doctors and scientists! The results of your hard work are actually God giving us miracles. It's not your hard work that does it at all. But once again, this brings up another question. Why did God wait until the 19th and 20th centuries to provide us with these medical miracles? Think of how much better life could have been for people in all of human history if we had only known that germs exist and how to stop them from spreading. That's it. No need to give us advanced surgical techniques or cancer treatments or anything like that. Just those two pieces of information, and pre-19th century life would be drastically improved. More babies would survive into adulthood. More women would survive childbirth. Fewer people dying of infected cuts. The spread of plagues would slow down. But no, God waited until, by all appearances, we were capable of discovering such truths without him before he provided us with such miracles. Carrying on, she says, the Savior would sooner send every angel out of heaven to protect his people than leave one person who trusts in him to be overcome by Satan. Those who comfort themselves with the assurance that there is no punishment for the sinner, who reject the truth that heaven has provided as a defense for the day of trouble, will accept the lies that Satan offers, the deceptive claims of spiritualism. So, again, we are painted a picture of a God who cannot protect his people without angelic help, while still pretending that this God is omnipotent. But more to the point, Ellen agreed in the last chapter that the non-believers don't get punished, or rather that the punishment was to be annihilated from existence, which I consider to not be a punishment. So if I don't consider that to be a punishment, and that's what you think that God does to the non-believers, then there is no punishment for the non-believers. Even by Ellen's own admission, such people wouldn't want to go to heaven. They would rather be annihilated, and God grants that request. So while she does frame it as though it's a punishment, even she admits that it's what they want. She ends this chapter with a reference to the apocalypse because, of course, she does, basically just saying that everyone who isn't a Christian will be lulled into a false sense of security that will last right up until God's wrath pours out and awakens them. So that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Bruce Davis 1803, who says, seriously disappointed in the lack of Dr. Peel news. Well, sorry, Bruce, I just don't find such news to be appealing. I didn't want to slip into covering that trope. I felt I needed to split with that bunch. Or maybe I'm just afraid of what I'll find. Sometimes I'm just too yellow to look into it. Okay, I'll stop now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to the link in the description to order your copy of Sometimes Illness Wins. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern, and with my partner every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the devils impersonating the dead people that are my channel. If you'd like God to not strip you of your power to lead millions of people astray, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Suggest that they don't go looking for doctrinal clarification all the time. What are you whining at? And birds... Many species of birds do indeed store food, and birds starve to death all the time. Can you... Like, between my phone and her, I'm just never gonna get this done.